Hello and welcome once again to Quarterlight. Today we're going to look at another British classic car, the Triumph Dolomite. The first Dolomite badged car, the Dolomite 1850, was launched in January 1972. Its launch unfortunately delayed once again with industrial action. I know, it's surprising, more industrial action at British Leyland, unfortunately. Although there is a new engine, the Dolomite is very closely related to the previous 1500 TC and Toledo, still being produced, and making a very confusing lineup of Triumph cars, which we'll see how they resolve that in this brochure. The brochure, incidentally, that we're going to look at is from 1977, and it does show how they brought the range together and made things a lot less confusing, to the buyer at least. But you can see on the front cover how there is something not quite right, and you can see how there's two models brought together. The most exciting Dolomite to come didn't arrive to the summer of 1973, however. The Dolomite Sprint. A really underrated car, and I'm surprised today there isn't more talk about this car and more enthusiastic reporting about it. It really is a forgotten classic car, which was far better than things like the Ford Escort that people go crazy over today. So let's have a look at that brochure now, and we'll see some of the models and how that range has now come together. So here we have it, the 1977 Triumph Dolomite brochure. And a great caption on there, isn't it? The Dolomites, one of Europe's great ranges. Now everything looks quite normal, everything looks okay on that brochure. You can see these are Dolomites, or at least to first glance. This of course is that Triumph Dolomite Sprint, which we'll look at in more details later on, with this vinyl roof on there, and the 1850, which is the version that was the first Triumph Dolomite all the way back in 1972, as we know. The first curious thing is we see this model, the 1500 HL, which we've not really talked about yet, but we'll look at in more detail as well. But like I say, the fronts all look the same, so, why not? The only really curious thing is if we open the brochure up and look at the front page and the back page at the same time. So let's do that now. So there we have it, these two curious Dolomite models here. It's a very complicated story how they actually came here, and we don't have time for the full story in this brochure right now. So we'll just briefly have a look at it. This one here is the Triumph Dolomite 1300. Basically it's a renamed, improved Toledo 1300 four-door. So like I say, when the Dolomite arrived, they had the Toledo. It was a very similar car. How many small cars does Triumph need? So they've tried to sort things out so it's less confusing. The strange thing is they just kind of have just renamed it in a way. You'd think at least they would give it the same front end treatment, but no, the front end still looks like a Toledo, which is a strange move. And if you look at cars today, not only is the same model look the same on the front, they try and do the same front end treatment on the entire range. So that's a little bit curious. Next to it we have another model with this strange front end on it. It's the Dolomite 1500, and that basically is just an improvement over the Toledo 1300. And then next to it you have this Dolomite 1500 HL, which is basically a premium specification of this model. At least they gave it the same front end treatment. HL meaning high line at this time, so a higher specification model. So now we've cleared the confusion over the Triumph range, let's dig inside and see what we can see inside the brochure. And there we have that Triumph Toledo, I do apologise, that Triumph Dolomite 1300 in a lovely period shot there with the family and a picnic. So that's a lovely picture in these sort of like brown vinyl trim. Still an attractive car, but this was kind of like the base model at the time. So basically this sort of rationalisation of all the different Triumph models happened in March 1976. So like I say, this is a 1977 brochure, so it's a good one to look at to see how they... When they rationalised the range, this Dolomite 1300 would have cost £2,070. Let's look at the next model. And there we have it, the Dolomite 1500, hiding that front end, so it's certainly more recognisable as a Dolomite now, and I think quite an attractive looking vehicle. The original styling was from Giovanni Michelotti, a long favoured designer for Triumph, and incidentally also the designer for the 2002 BMW, which we'll talk about a little bit, because that really was why the Dolomite Sprint came about. We haven't got to the Dolomite Sprint yet, so we'll look at the next page for more shots of the Dolomite 1500. And there is the inside of that Dolomite 1500 with this lovely sort of like fake looking wood, which is very 70s, and these nice little controls. I think overall it was an attractive looking car that Triumph had. A reasonably small boot, but then again it was really not the biggest car in the world, but it's certainly a nicely styled four-door sedan. Let's look at the next model. Oh, and incidentally, that 1500 would have cost £2,205 at the time. So here we have it, the Dolomite 1500 HL or High Line model in a very attractive yellow. Now we've got the Dolomite front end treatment on it. It was really a direct replacement for the Triumph 1500 TC with the same 4 headlight nose, long tail body and the 71 brake horsepower 1493cc engine. However, it also inherited the completely equipped Dolomite 1850 style fascia and full array of instruments, as we can see here. Both overdrive and automatic transmission were both optional extras on this vehicle. Let's look at the next one, which is the original Dolomite, the 1850. Let's have a look at that now. So there is that 1850, and it's a very nice sort of blue shade with a stripe on there and version. Still with the 91 brake horsepower slant 4 overhead camshaft engine, still with the same excellent layout of instruments, as we can just about make out here. And all these were shared with that 1500 HL with the same type of road wheels as we can see on there. But from this point they also had the sundial window glass. So let's look at the next one, which was really a model that came out to compete with cars like the BMW 2002. So let's look at that now, because this was kind of like a good car. It was a fast car, and now the prices for these particular models, the 1850, were now up to £2,723. So certainly an affordable car at the time, a fast car at the time, but it wasn't quite fast enough to compete with, like I say, the cars like the BMW 2002, which was why in summer 1973, Excuse me, I'm needing some tea very soon, I think. The Triumph Dolomite Sprint was launched, like I say, in summer 1973. So let's look at that car now. So there is that car now. It's showing kind of like a Leyland Cars competition car there, and also the one that you could go down to the dealership. Very much unchanged, like the previous models have all had changes. This one wasn't changed. Like I say, it was going to be a high price now there, and the prices were really rising sharply at this stage. And later, as we get to the 80s, this started to become unfashionable. This particular one had a 1998cc 127 brake horsepower engine with an acclaimed top speed of 119 miles per hour and 0 to 60 in 8.4 seconds when new. Now, if you think about that in 1973, that's an extremely fast car. Like we was talking about the other day, the Morris Oxford, that had finally reached a top speed of 80 miles per hour, and that was still being sold up to 1971, although certainly out of date by that time. This is 1983, and you've got a car doing 119 miles per hour and a 0 to 60 at 8.4 seconds. Certainly more than enough to compete with those cars like the BMW 2002 and Alfa Romeos indeed. Originally they were finished in a very 70s yellow. Unfortunately that gave way to a popularity for brown of all colours, a very 70s colour, being very popular with them, with that matching vinyl covered roof, although I think they look better in yellow than brown personally. So let's have a look at the next page. And really this is showing that Triumph Dolomite Sprint has been a racing car, if you will, and certainly it was a fast car. And I often think this is a very underrated car. Not much is talked about these anymore, but certainly at the time when them speeds came about, it must have been quite a revelation for lots of people. Similar sort of problems to the normal British Leyland cars, and indeed 1970s cars in general, rust. But then again, I think that pretty much was a killer on most 1970s cars. Rust issues hadn't been really thought about in great detail, and you could say the manufacturer didn't care if they rusted, because when they rusted you went and bought a new car. But it certainly was an issue at the time, and sadly why so few of these Dolomites still remain. This far side is a specification sheet for the different engines, as you can see on there. I'm not going to go into great details over all that specification, but that's what's on there. And then finally that takes us to the final page. The final page is just the specifications continued and the dimensions of the actual Triumph Dolomite itself. So there we have it, the Triumph Dolomite range, and one of the few times I would agree with the brochure, certainly one of Europe's great ranges. It was a great range, all the way from the basic 1300 right down to that Sprint. So what replaced these cars? I guess you could say the Triumph Acclaim was something that replaced them ultimately, giving a more reliable vehicle as it was closely linked to Honda. But even that didn't last too long, and certainly didn't have any relation to these rear-wheel drive cars. Thank you so much for watching Quartlight once again. This particular brochure from 1977 really is in as good a condition as the day somebody picked it up off the showroom floor. Sadly, we can't say that about most of these Dolomites, as we mentioned, rust was the real killer. There'll be more brochure reviews coming really soon, so for now, take care, please do like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.